It's officially week 1 of training for the Copenhagen Marathon. It's on May 10th, which is 12 weeks away, and that's plenty of time to build some marathon fitness. So I most recently ran a 2:54 marathon at CIM in December, which was my third marathon and also a PB for me. And in Copenhagen, I'm aiming to go under 250 for the first time. I wanted to make this series to document my training for Copenhagen, but before we get into all that, in this video I wanted to talk about how I got to where I am today as a runner, because I definitely didn't start out as a 2:54 marathoner. Like a lot of people, I started running in 2020 during the pandemic. I played basketball as a kid before that, and then switched to ultimate frisbee when I was in high school and university. I reached a decently competitive level playing ultimate frisbee, getting to around the provincial level here in Canada, but that's pretty much where I peaked with that. Pretty much my entire cardio background before running comes from the sports I played when I was younger. When I first started running, I'd run laps around Jean Monts Park in Montreal, which is where I was living at the time, and each lap was around a mile long if I remember correctly, and I remember I'd just go out and do 1 or 2 laps on a run in the summer, and I would just be completely gassed by the end of it. I would be just absolutely wiped after these runs because I was going at almost max effort without really realizing it at the time. I started off running in a beat up pair of trainers that I had lying around, and eventually it just hurt to run in them so much that I was kind of forced to buy my first pair of actual running shoes. Now fast forward a bit, I continued to run maybe once or twice a week throughout the rest of 2020 and into 2021. And in September 2021, I moved to Seattle to start working full-time as a software engineer. But before I made that move, I wanted to run a half marathon the day before. I didn't really train for this properly at all and pretty much just sent it, despite having never run more than 12K in a single run before. And I started out way too fast when I ran this half, and my entire body just gave out at the 16K mark. I somehow managed to limp to 21.1K, and according to Strava, I did that half in 2:11 and 5 seconds. So that was my half marathon debut, I guess. Fast forward again, it's 2022 now, and a couple of friends of mine in Seattle tell me that they're going to run the BMO Vancouver half that's happening in May. After my last half marathon experience, I needed some convincing if I'm being honest, but eventually I decided to sign up for it. This time I trained a bit more seriously. I ran 2 to 3 times per week, and following the advice of my physio at the time, my longest run leading up to the half was around 16K. I ran the entire race with my friend Anthony and honestly felt great the whole time. And I even finished with a bit of a kick to clock a time of 1:52 and 2 seconds. Now, I don't remember exactly what happened after that half, but I know at some point later that year, I decided that the next logical step for me would be to tackle the full marathon. I signed up for next year's Vancouver Marathon, and this was, in my mind at least, when I started to become a serious runner. Now, it's January 2023, and after searching for a marathon training plan online, I found a free 16-week marathon plan from Runner's World. Looking back, this training block is pretty funny to me because I just did so many things wrong without realizing at the time. I didn't know anything about zones or effort levels or the purposes of different types of runs, so I basically just blasted all of my runs at marathon pace or faster, sticking my heart rate solidly in zone 3 or higher on every single run. The plan called for 5 runs a week, but I could only do 4 at most pretty much every week because I was just so tired all the time. My weekly mileage was actually surprisingly reasonable, but it could only go so high off 4 runs a week. One thing I remember really vividly though is throughout my training, I'd often visualize what it would feel like to cross the finish line of the marathon. In my head, it was like a movie scene. Everything's in slow motion, you're rushing to cross the finish line, you make it over the line and just burst into tears, overcome with emotion at the incredible feat that you just pulled off. Except that didn't really happen at all in the race itself. Like so many people do in their first marathon, I went out flying and paid the price for it later in the race. I clocked a 140 split in the first half, which ended up being a little bit too quick, and things were feeling good until maybe the 30K mark, and then at 35K, the wheels just completely fell off the bus. My left hip flexor completely seized up, and I remember having to stop to just try and stretch it while kind of in a lunge position. For context, the 35K mark in the Vancouver Marathon is on the Stanley Park seawall, and truly this part of the race is wild because so many people are bonking at this point. In my mind, I remember 2 things very vividly: seeing runners on the ground everywhere just in pain, and also me getting passed by a bunch of the runners I'd passed earlier in the race. I was limping for a few kilometers and then somehow got back up to a decent pace to close things out, and I ended up crossing the line in 3:29 and 46 seconds, just barely sneaking under 3:30. Where I imagined in my head that I'd be super emotional crossing the line, I completely didn't account for how much pain I'd be in as I was crossing the finish line. I didn't cry or anything. I just sat down somewhere in the finish chute and was so glad the race was over. I've never been more sore from anything in my entire life than that first marathon. I think it took me a week just to be able to walk up and down stairs again normally, and I'd also lost a decent amount of weight from underfueling throughout my training, but thankfully I had a big appetite after the race and I managed to get back up to my regular weight pretty quickly. And to be honest, that summer after the race, I just didn't run a whole lot. Looking back, I was for sure burnt out from just overtraining and I needed some time to just relax after the race. But then in September 2023, I started to get really serious about running. The thing I distinctly remember from this point in my running journey is that I decided to finally look into what Zone 2 is after hearing about it so much. And yeah, this is when I really fell down the rabbit hole of endurance training and all the scientific literature behind it. This is when I started to understand the methodology and structure behind endurance training and what the purpose of each run actually is. After roughly guessing what my Zone 2 heart rate should be, my ego took a huge hit when I went from running around 5 flat per kilometer to 6:30. Even though I'd been running for a couple of years at this point, I still couldn't keep my heart rate in Zone 2 when I first started out doing this. And that was super frustrating. I stuck with it though, and soon enough I started to discover what easy runs are actually supposed to feel like. And around this time, post-marathon, I felt like I was at a fork in the road as a runner. I could either continue progressing distance-wise and maybe train for an ultra marathon, or I could go back to a shorter distance I'd already done and just try to focus on speed and running that distance faster. I went with the latter option and once again signed up for the BMO Vancouver half, this time in 2024, and I was aiming to run a super fast half marathon time. I was a bit delusional back then, if I'm being honest, thinking that a potential stretch goal would be to go a sub 120, which was totally unrealistic, and more realistically, I was aiming for a sub 122. I later adjusted my goal to a sub 123, which was still a bit too optimistic. I was still running on my own at this point with no coach and not part of any run clubs, and I found another training plan online to base my training off of. I split my training into 2 8-week blocks. The first was for a 10K race in Seattle where I ran a 40-minute, 16-second 10K, setting a PB, and then the next 8 weeks was for the half marathon. To this day, the biggest mistake I've ever made as a runner came the night before this half marathon. I decided that I'd be doing a carb load because I heard that's what you're supposed to do before a race like this. And I didn't really plan it out at all. So the night before the race, I just didn't have any dinner ready to go. I ordered takeout from a vegan restaurant that's known for using chickpeas and everything. And a lot of the food was fried as well. So essentially, I had a ton of fat and fiber right before my race. Oh, brother. So race morning rolls around, I've got my carbon shoes on. The nerves are there, but I'm feeling relatively good. Once the race got going, I felt good until the 12K mark when my stomach decided that my actions have consequences. I spent the rest of the race being on the absolute verge of shitting myself, and despite wanting to stop at a porta potty several times, like probably every 2 minutes, I somehow made it to the finish line and finished in 1:24 and 56 seconds, just barely going sub 125. Without getting into too many details, the aftermath was pretty brutal and I made many trips to the bathroom for the rest of the day. Yeah. Before this half though, the fastest half I'd run was a 136 unofficially while training for my marathon, so this was a huge PB. I took some time off to recover after, and then before long, I'd started to train for my second marathon in Victoria, BC. The marathon was in October, so I was training through the summer where there were a lot of hot days that honestly made training pretty tough, but also got me into great shape. I was eyeing a sub 250 marathon, which, similar to my half, was a bit ambitious. I made a lot of mistakes in this training block as well, the main one being that I ran all of my marathon pace runs just way too fast, realistically doing them at more of a threshold effort, but overall this went a lot better than the training for my first marathon. I started to run 6 times per week for the first time ever, and I was hitting higher weekly mileage as well. One week I hit 100K for the first time, and there were some spicy workouts within that week as well. It was just a bit too much load though, and I ended up picking up an overuse injury in my foot that really flared up towards the end of my marathon. On race day, I started out at 255 marathon pace, crossed halfway in 128 on the dot, and then started to fade pretty quick around the 25K mark. The temperature started to get warmer later in the race, and it was pretty much just a death march to the finish line at that point, where I was doing everything I could just to not stop and keep my legs moving. I finished in 258.05, and even though I didn't go under 255, I was genuinely just so happy that I ran a sub 3-hour marathon and only my second attempt at the distance. At 40K in the race, I remember taking a step and my right foot just flaring up in a burning pain all of a sudden. It kind of went away a little bit after a while, and I managed to push through it to get to the finish line. But after the race, I got sidelined with a foot injury that would really limit how much I could run for the rest of the year. I ended up going on a trip to Asia at the end of the year and took about 2 weeks completely off running during that time. And combined with the rehab exercise I was doing, I was back to being fully healthy at the start of 2025. 2025 was without a doubt the biggest running year I've had so far. I set a PB in every distance essentially, and most importantly, after moving back to Vancouver towards the end of 2024, I finally started to get involved in the local running community. I started running with some social run clubs and also joined the Vancouver Falcons Athletic Club, or VFAC for short, which is a workout-based run club with tons of incredible runners. The club has several runners that have ran in the 2:30s for the marathon and even a few that are in the 2:20s, which it's just absolutely mind-boggling to run with these people and get lapped by them on the track. I joined the club in February just as I'd started training for the Vancouver Sunrun 10K, where I was aiming for a big PB. I ran my first all-out 5K along the way and set an official PB of 18:37, and then despite going out way too hot and paying for it, I ran a 37:48 at the Sunrun to knock off almost 2.5 minutes off my 10K PB. Being a part of this club and running with other people both took my running to a new level and also gave me a newfound love for the sport. I think 2025 was the year where I truly fell in love with running. I pretty much just loved every aspect of it, from the cool people I was meeting to the sessions that pushed my limits to the easy runs where you could just go out and appreciate your surroundings. It was amazing. After my 10K though, I did a short 8-week build for the Vancouver half, which confusingly is different from the BMO Vancouver half and happens in late June instead of May. I ran a 1:21:22, except the course was about 300 meters too short since a turnaround point was placed too early on the course by accident. I guess my time should have been a 1:22 something, but I didn't count this as an official PB, even though I definitely would have beaten my previous PB from 2024. 6 days later, I raced my first 5K on the track and ran that in 18:13 to set another 5K PB. It was a great learning experience since I'd never done a track race before, and my pacing wasn't great, but I still came away with a PB, which I can't complain about. Unfortunately though, this is where disaster struck. A week before I ran the half, I was doing strides at the end of an easy run when I stepped on a rock that was about golf ball sized, full force when I was mid-stride. I was able to still run my half and my track 5K, but after that, it really flared up to about an 8 out of 10 pain. This was a pretty frustrating injury that I really underestimated. And it turns out I had a bone bruise in my foot that took about 6 weeks to heal before I could really start to train seriously again without any pain. I took a couple of weeks to ramp my mileage back up after that, and then suddenly I was 16 weeks out from my third marathon, CIM. I signed up for CIM at the end of 2024, and my intention was to end off 2025 with a big shot at a marathon PB. My foot injury had kind of derailed that plan a bit, but with 16 weeks to go, I was finally feeling like I could start to train seriously again, so the timing was pretty good. I kept things a bit cautious in the first 4 weeks of that build, just to be on the safe side, and thankfully my foot didn't flare back up again. On paper, this was definitely the best marathon build I've had so far. I prioritized consistently high mileage over just doing a couple flashy weeks here and there, and I felt like I managed my overall training load super well while still running 6 days per week. And on the way to CIM, I did 2 tune-up races, a 10K in week 5, which I ran in 38:31 on a pretty hilly and tough course, and a half marathon, which I ran in 1:26:46, also on a very tough course, but also where I missed the last turn to go into the finish chute and added probably about a minute and a half to my time. These results honestly weren't super confidence inspiring based on the times I was putting up, but I felt pretty strong in both races, which funnily enough was a confidence booster. Now, I don't fault myself for this given the injury, but if anything, I think I was slightly too conservative in my build for CIM and definitely left some fitness on the table. A lot of weeks only had really one hard run, and a lot of my long runs were just done at too easy of an effort. That being said though, I built a really strong base with the higher mileage I was running, and I had a great race at CIM. I finished in 2:54:29, setting a new marathon PB by about 3.5 minutes. But the thing I was happiest about was that this was the first time I'd run a negative split in a marathon. I ran the first half in 1:28 and 23 seconds and the back half in 1:26 and 6 seconds. I came out of CIM without really any injuries, which was a first for me post-marathon. And I took 1 week completely off running afterwards to recover and then started to do a 30-minute easy run every other day. And after that, I slowly started to ramp my mileage back up. This was my first time coming out of a marathon feeling as strong and healthy as I did, and that was a nice way to cap off 2025. Despite how strong I felt at CIM, I only took off about 3.5 minutes from my previous PB. I'll never complain about getting a PB, but at the same time, I have this feeling that I'm capable of pushing myself more this year and really knocking all of my times down. I want to really go for it in 2026 and see what I can do. Towards the end of my CIM build, actually, I started working with a coach, Kevin O'Connor, here in Vancouver, and that's the first time I've had a coach for running. He helped out with my taper for CIM, which was great, and now this build for Copenhagen will be the first full build that we work together on, which I'm super excited about. This year started off with a sort of mini 5-week build leading up to the first half, which is a half marathon with a super deep field that happens every February here in Vancouver. I had some solid mileage in those 5 weeks where I went over 90K in a couple of them, and there was a good amount of intensity in those weeks as well. And the race itself also went well, where I pulled off another negative split to clock a 1:22.13 and finally set a new half marathon PB. The equivalent marathon time for that is a 2:51.45, which is getting kind of close to that 2:50 mark. And that takes us to today. I took a bit of a down week after the first half, and now we're 12 weeks out from the Copenhagen Marathon. I'm hungry for a big PB, and I'm going to really dig in and push myself for 12 weeks, and then just send it on race day. Let me know if there's anything you'd like to see in future videos. Otherwise, stay tuned to see how the training goes. Peace.